as we move on, I'm Steve Erlanger. I'm with the New York Times. We have a great panel here. I won't introduce everyone just because you have all of your bump. We're going to have a conversation. I'd like to leave some time truly at the end for questions from you. So as you go along, think about what you might want to ask. We have, I think, one of the most important themes today, which is democracy and the law. And as we all know, Aristotle said that the law should govern. But it does make you wonder, shouldn't the people govern? And then it also makes you wonder, the law can govern in authoritarian governments also. So is democracy and the law, are they inseparable? Are they different things? What do you think? Betsy, since you're sitting next to me, why don't you...
I'll dive in.
Dive in.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to the New York Times for the invitation to be here. It's a great privilege. This is a critical question, and my quick answer is that they are separate concepts, but inseparable in practice, ideally. In order to achieve true liberal democracy, there needs to be a legal framework that supports that democracy, that provides for the checks and balances, for the protections of individual rights, that really breathe life into democracy. And so law is critically important, but you're absolutely right to point out that it's which law. Law is...
And whose law?
And whose law.
Right.
Law is really conceptually agnostic as to democracy. There can be pro-democratic law and anti-democratic law. And that's why we tend to think about this concept of the rule of law to reflect the ideas, the institutional structure that is so important to support democracy. So I would say democracy requires the rule of law, not just law.
Okay. Julie, what do you think?
Well, thank you. I do. Firstly, I want to say thank you to the New York Times for the privilege to be here and to the city for the hospitality. I agree with Betsy that there may appear to be a tension between the people and the law, but I think Aristotle was saying that the people should govern through the law, which obviously gives you the rule of law. And that pretty much is what we say when we talk about the rule of law. But the questions that you have raised do arise around who makes those laws that eventually become part of what we regard as the rule of law. But if we look at the rule of law in its universality, then it may transcend the parochial formulation of the local laws. For example, in South Africa, under apartheid, we had laws and people were governing according to those laws. But when we look back now, we say we had rule by law, not the rule of law, because the rule of law transcends just what laws you can create domestically and includes universal human rights.
Good, because it just seems to me sometimes that the law is an instrument of power. I mean, that it's something very different from actual democracy. I mean, it's meant to control the people rather than, I know you can argue certainly it allows them to have expression and in certain democracies you have freedoms of speech and freedom of property that are protected reasonably well. But you also have a lot of places we would call democracies that are quite corrupted. So I'm curious, I mean, what does the people do with a democracy wherein the law and the administration of the law is corrupt?
Yeah, so it's very important to bring some rigor to the definition of rule of law for precisely this reason. One of the dangers that we see in today's world is kind of weaponization of law. And it's interesting. We saw in a first backlash wave against democracy, authoritarian leaders getting very clever about using the mechanics of elections to retain power and to they corrupted elections. So that was kind of a first wave of this backlash against democracy. And a second wave that we're seeing now is manipulation of legal institutions, of the rule of law, and with authoritarian leaders getting very clever about consolidating power, but wrapping it up and even labeling it as the rule of law. So it's important for us to kind of reclaim that definition of what is the rule of law. The organization that I work for has made this a focus of our efforts and come up with a definition for the rule of law that is unfortunately complex, as is this concept, with 8 factors of the rule of law that include things like constraints on government power, fundamental rights, protections against corruption, enforcement of regulations, civil justice, criminal justice, law and security, and open government, principles of open government. And then we've divided that yet into 44 sub-factors. So it's a complex concept.
You need judges to interpret it.
Yes, exactly. And yet it's very important that we own it and call rule of law, and corruptions of rule of law, just that.
Right. Well, Thuli, you come from a country that, in a way, needed a revolution to change what the rule of law was. Can you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely.
And what's happened since?
Well, the approach to South Africa in terms of the rule of law is pretty much in line with the World Justice Forum's approach to the rule of law, which is you express the will of the people through the Constitution. In South Africa, the transition from the apartheid colonial era has led to a constitution that pretty much maps up the vision of society, the values that should underpin that society, the basic entitlements of the people in the way of human rights, the values of that society, and ultimately strong institutions to make sure that when anybody steps out of line in the original framework of the trias politica, there are institutions to push back. For example, in the original model of democracy, you have in the state the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. So in South Africa, we built also Chapter 9 institutions, or institutions under Chapter 9 of our Constitution, that bring additional accountability. And all of this is really to safeguard the will of the people, because we believe that people are governing by having expressed themselves through the Constitution. And ideally, whoever they elect at any given time should adhere to the Constitution in whatever they do. But people do deviate, and that's where we bring in the judges. But you're going to argue that judges are people too, and they themselves can step out of line. But this whole system is sort of checking and balancing each other. When the judges step out of line, the people start screaming through hashtags and things like that, and the legislature can change the Constitution or change the law.
Yeah.
Then we can bring in also the international framework, which I was hoping we'd discuss, that when the domestic setup fails, we then can appeal to the international framework, but provided we recast it to align it with contemporary challenges.
Stephen, if I could comment on the South African experience, I think there are important lessons that were brought to bear in that institutional design.
Yes.
And I would characterize it as kind of a belt and suspenders approach to reinforcing the rule of law and democratic systems. Because you can't, we need a kind of complex set of checks and balances. It can't just be that we rely on a constitutional court, because that can become co-opted or corrupted, or just rely on the parliament. But we also need independent institutions like an election commission or the Office of the Public Protector that Thuli so valiantly led. Independent ombudspersons kinds of offices. We need the press, we need civil society, and we need support internationally. And because what we are seeing in a number of contexts is that there can be kind of a stealth approach to eroding these institutions. And unless we have kind of many different ways in which to reinforce the rule of law, or different avenues, that we can see the system collapse.
No, because I mean, part of what fascinates me, since we're in Europe and in the European Union, we've talked a little bit about Hungary and Poland before. Poland's a particularly interesting case because in the name of freedom, right, and in the name of anti-communism, and in the name of ridding the system of old communist judges, the Polish government is basically trying to purge its court. So what does one do about that?
Well, I think we have to resort to international pressure, and then also to the people. So while the rule of law reinforces the rights of the people, then also the people need to defend the rule of law when it comes under threat. And in order to do that, though, people have to understand the rule of law. And this is a very significant challenge for those of us who care about this, because it is a complex concept. I bet you don't know what today is in the United States. It is Constitution Day.
I should have known. That's right.
So it's a very important day for the rule of law in the United States. 231 years ago, our Constitution was signed. And yet, Americans don't celebrate Constitution Day. And Americans really take their rule of law for granted and don't defend it. And there's a danger of that in Poland today, too.
Just one quick question about that to you before we go to Thuli. The American Constitution is really, really hard to change. Do you think that's a mistake?
Probably not. I think one of the, it's a double-edged sword, of course, but one of the problems that we see with reinforcing rule of law and democracy around the world are where constitutions are too easily amended. Then it becomes very vulnerable to this kind of erosion of institutions, packing of constitutional courts in ways that make it very difficult to defend democracy.
Right. Well, Nelson Mandela once said, even the most benevolent of governments have within them people with propensities for human failings, and I think that's what we're seeing in this particular case. And what is the answer there? One is a strong constitution, strong institutions, but drawing from my experience in South Africa as a public protector, I would say that having that polycentric accountability framework in your democracy is excellent, but that can never be a good substitute for the demos in democracy. I think in modern democracies, we've really allowed people to become consumers of democracy as opposed to engaged citizens. And then institutions can be captured, institutions can gravitate towards clientelism and saving in particular, and they can be corrupted. And I think we need to go back to have an engaged citizenry that understands that constitution. I mean, if you think about the Bible, the church had people with autocratic tendencies in those days before Martin Luther King made sure that everyone had their own Bible and read it. We need to make sure that in our communities, everyone has a constitution, they read it, and they get opportunities to discuss it more or less the same way as we discuss our Bibles, to make sure that then people become really the buffer. They become their own protectors in addition to the media, in addition to institutions supporting democracy, and in addition to the courts.
It's a very good point, that we have become a bit lazy. We've become consumers of democracy rather engaged. I think I keep thinking of Yasha Monk's metaphor of everyone has their little glass of water. He was a little less explicit about the fire that we're supposed to pour it on. So I was going to ask you this. What do you do when the instruments of the law, the agents of the law, are visibly violating it? I mean, I'm thinking in America, you know, we think of ourselves as a just society, but there's been very clear cases of racist activities on the part of the police, on sexist activities on the part of the police, of all kinds of, you know, the iPhone has helped a lot to sort of show us these issues, but issues, I mean, of mistreatment of racial minorities by the police, some of them themselves racial minorities, has become vivid and hot, and I think has become like one of these sensitive issues that helps the divisions already in America, you know, between the Trump people and the other people. Do you think, I mean, would be true of Africa too. I mean, are there enough controls over the people we hire to police and keep the laws? What do we do about that? Because clearly there are lots of abuses.
Well, in our case, there are controls. It's a question of maybe they're not always as agile as they should be. If I look at what happened with us, with a president that ended up resigning, there was a time when people were saying, are these controls working? Is this glorified constitution with the paper it's written on? The truth is, when one center of democracy fails, another picks up. In our case, it would be obviously the main control should be a good parliament, a strong legislature, where people have been elected because they have a good vision of society, a good value system, and good skills in terms of exercising democracy. Then you have to have good courts and good Chapter 9 institutions. In South Africa, we have that framework, and it has worked. And an independent media that is very active in terms of its guardianship of democracy is also part of the deal. But I still am going to say, Stephen, is all of this works better when there is democracy literacy. At least my organization, the Tuma Foundation, has found that the weakest link in our democracy is a disengaged citizenry, and where there's less democracy literacy than there should be. But also sometimes I find that the people we elect to office, they themselves are not democracy literate. We need people to have driver's licenses to drive a car, but we'll elect somebody to go and drive a democracy when they've never said anything about what democracy means and what kind of society are we trying to build. And that's when then they become divisive, they refuse to embrace diversity, because when we elected them, they had not shown anything that says they respect the Constitution and therefore they're going to implement it.
Well, I would agree. I think the strategy really depends on the context. So in the United States, we still have a relatively robust check in our federal judiciary, and so you see a strategy of resorting to the courts in litigation brought by civil society organizations to challenge some of these extra-legal acts. And that is working relatively well, I think. To date, it's a slow process, but it's effective. The media is, of course, another avenue for shining a light on these gaps in the rule of law, and that's another strategy that can be very effective.
I just, at the end, kind of want to broaden it out a bit. I mean, I've worked in a lot of countries all over the world, and I'm always love talking to Kishore Mahbubani about whether values are universal or are they not. I don't actually believe that they are. I believe that the Chinese have different values than we have, and they hold them just as strongly. Now, some of them are exactly the same, but we had Confucius on stage. Confucius's notion of the best society was not at all a Western notion. So you've worked in international courts, in the International Tribunal on the former Yugoslavia. Now, this is kind of international law, but these are the law, supposedly universal values based on democratic ideas that try to bring international criminals, quote unquote, to justice. Do you think this is, now, the Trump people have come out against the ICC, the United States will never join the ICC, but do you think this is, as Kishore would say, an imposition of Western values and structures and condemnations on the rest of the world? I mean, there's a lot of feeling in Africa, for instance, that the criminal tribunal is only aimed at Africans, not at anyone else. So I'm just curious what both of you think on this theme anyway.
Right. Well, I think there certainly are different values in different contexts, but there are also these universal values, and many of them have been memorialized in international law that is widely subscribed to, or in some cases universally subscribed to. And institutions like the International Criminal Court are focused on enforcing that law, that universally subscribed to law. Things like the prohibition against torture, or gross violations of the Geneva Conventions. And so I think there is a strong basis there for that international enforcement by a body that has been established, by states to enforce, to hold them to those commitments and enforce those commitments. There can be challenges in the implementation, of course.
Absolutely.
That's when politics comes to play, and that's where the challenges lie. But the underlying law and the idea of the institution is, I think, firmly based in universal values.
Thuli, what do you think?
I share the same view that some of the values are universal and some are not. I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was an attempt by wise, mostly men and a few women, to crystallize and bring together some of those shared values of humanity, to make sure that if we all act in compliance with those values, there was hope that we would never again have a world war. And the same thing happened with the UN Charter. But personally, as somebody who works on social justice, my chair at Stellenbosch University is about social justice, my research has shown that after the World War, and because of communism, there was really an attempt to implement all of the contents of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But when the Iron Curtain sort of fell, when the Berlin Wall fell, the values that have to do with human solidarity somehow were lost, particularly in the West, and hence people have been left behind. We can complain a lot about people gravitating towards leaders who are non-democratic, etc. It's simply because people are looking for answers in terms of people who are going to remember them, people who are going to see them, people who are going to respond to their pain. Whether they'll do that or not, it doesn't matter. The political entrepreneurs, they're using that space to sell what they're not gonna provide, but at least they know that that's what our people need. So going back, I think we do need to go back, maybe a new deal globally, a new deal around what does it take to live together peacefully, or at least that's what the Tollbeck Foundation says. We already live together through globalization.
That's great.
But if we are going to live together, how do we distill the golden rule? We call it Ubuntu in Africa, but I mean, in the West, you've got the golden rule. But it's all really about don't harm me, let me not harm you, and how do we find a way to coexist peacefully?
Thank you. I think what we're going to try to do is take some questions, but I have the honor to say, just hold on one sec, we have a Greek foreign minister with us in the front row, Mr. Katrougalos, and we'd love to hear your point of view, sir. Please.
Thank you very much. Short remarks. The first is that we can separation of democracy and rule of law. Illiberal democracy is, of course, one of them, but undemocratic liberal
up, sorry. Keep trying anyway.
Okay. I was saying that we have a
Okay. The universal value of patience. Go ahead.
Well, I was saying that we can have a separation from rule of law and democracy in two separate forms. Illiberal democracies, we have been very much concerned about that, but also undemocratic liberalism, that is insulation of important political decisions from the democratic process, or in the way that our President of the Republic has expressed this morning, dominance of the economic over the political. And this is not just enlightened despotism, Prussia, where there are courts in Berlin, but not democracy in Reichstag. Economic governance in EU, in WTO, has these characteristics of undemocratic liberalism. Second remark is that law itself is a battleground. So usually judiciary is the least dangerous branch for human rights and democracy, but not always. And I don't have in mind the current composition of the US Supreme Court, but the bras de fer of Roosevelt with the same Supreme Court during the New Deal. At this time, Roosevelt was the good guy trying to promote social legislation, regulation. So my final remark is that these two trends are alimenting one each other. If we do not take care about this explosion of inequalities, the perception that many electorates have that the economy is rigged in favor of the rich and the powerful, we risk to have both outcomes, both illiberal democracies and
Thank you very, very much, sir. Let's try to take like 3 questions and then quickly go back to the panel. We've only got 3 minutes, so Rob Riemann, but please brief questions, not big commentaries, and then the gentleman next to you. Yes, you, sir. And then there's a woman in the back with her hand way up. Okay, fine, please.
So James Whitman, who's a professor of law at Yale University, published a very important book last year entitled Hitler's American Model, in which on very thorough research he showed that so much of the Nuremberg laws by Mr. Hitler were copy-paste from the American laws of the Jim Crow era, which shows 2 things. First of all, that America at that time was not the model of democracy in the world, as it is not right now, when more than 60 million Americans can vote for a classic contemporary fascist into the White House. The best thing the New York Times did in these days is to bring back Socrates. Yep. And Socrates made his claim that not the rule of law, but justice is the most important thing, which doesn't appeal on the responsibility of every citizen. Because the big question is, how do we cannot do without the rule of law, but how can we be sure that there will be just laws?
Very good, perfect, thanks. Could you hand it back to that gentleman? Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Hamid Al-Ajlan from Kuwait. When it comes to the rule of law, there are 2 things. There is respect for the rule of law, and there is fear of law. Well, when we talk about Western Europe, we talk about the respect of law, rule of law. But when we talk about the Middle East, we have 2 issues. There is a fear of government law, and there is a fear of religious law. And the problem of the religious law is not really fear of clergy, but fear of the consciousness of the people of what they think of religion.
Yes.
So when you
I
are
think
a writer,
those are very good points. Thank you. And now the woman in the back, please, because we're really running out of time. Thank you. You make a very good point about religious pressure.
Hi, I'm Cristina from Ecuador, South America. We've been talking about how the power overlooks the rule of law, but what happens when it's citizens the ones that overlook the rule of law? For instance, Ecuador have had like 20 constitutions up until now, so it's not part of our culture. How do you make it be part of us and be important?
Great. perfect. Now you've each got 30 seconds. Thuli, why don't you go ahead?
Well,
Answer whatever you wish.
maybe the quick one that I would answer is the one about the rule of law. And in the case where your leaders are leading, but the law being applied is oppressive, for me, I'd like to make a distinction between the rule of law and rule by law. That when people are being oppressed through the law, that's rule by law. When there is a discrepancy between law and justice, then it's not the rule of law, because the rule of law is more than just having laws. It's about having laws that apply to everyone equally and nobody's above the law. So the moment your president, for example, can do whatever they want and then say, and then threaten, for example, institutions, as happened in our case, and probably is happening in other countries that we know of, institutions that are holding him accountable, that's no longer the rule of law, that is rule by law, and there's a discrepancy then between law and justice. But just lastly to say, ultimately we need to make sure that the people are at the center of it, but we also reform the international process to make sure that, that there's no exceptionalism, there's no unilateralism, but secondly, there's adaptability for those systems to meet the demands of our day.
Great, thank you. Betsy, 35 seconds.
35 seconds, okay. So I agree completely with Thuli's remarks and particularly about the dangers of rule by law. And we often think of rule of law meaning no one is above the law, but equally important is that no one is under the law, that the law is not used to repress, and that's critically important to this concept. I want to pick up on the question about
briefly, please.
Ecuador, yes, and the dangers of citizenry that is not supportive of the rule of law. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about this forum is the New York Times using its bully pulpit to reach broadly and spread ideas about democracy and rule of law. I was pleased to meet some filmmakers in the audience. I think that those of us who work in wonky newspapers and think tanks need the assistance of those of you with skills to reach broader audiences and communicate this message.
Thank you very much.